Our next speaker is Les Hems, Tomorrow's Agenda, Net Balance in Sydney. So Les is the founding director of research and development at the Tomorrow's Agenda Research Institute, which is part of Net Balance. Tomorrow's Agenda Research Institute has been set up to provide a bridge between practice and academia and to undertake academic quality applied research. Les's primary interest is in undertaking research that leads to innovation in policy and practice. For example, undertaking the feasibility study for social impact bonds in 2011. Social impact bonds are extremely interesting, and I hope we're going to hear them mentioned in Les's talk, and if not, that we get an opportunity in the questions to hear a bit about them. And Les is currently preparing green papers on public service mutuals and creating shared value. Les has held senior research positions at Johns Hopkins University, University College London, and the University of New South Wales. But apart from that, he's passionate about Jimi Hendrix and the Coventry City Football Club. Please welcome Les Hems.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to share with you some of my thoughts and also some of my kind of predictions, I think, for what we're going to face over the next 3 or 4 years. When I arrived here in Australia back in December 2009 and working with Cheryl Kerno and Peter Shergold, I was really struck at what we talked about right at the beginning, that there's relatively high levels of prosperity in Australia. You know, I came from the UK, which post-GFC was a pretty desolate place, almost back to the 1980s, which was a shocking recession if you're in a town in the Midlands like myself from Coventry. So that kind of very differentiated experience for the wealthy and those who are at the what's politely called in developing countries the bottom of the pyramid. So we have these wicked social problems. I think the GFC was a real wake-up call for capitalism, where all those people who argued that trickle-down economics would make everybody prosperous in the long run, that clearly the GFC kind of exposed that, the frailties of that particular theory. And what we're seeing at the moment with the resource boom coming to an end, reduction in tax revenues, will the Chinese economy continue to grow and so on, all those things mean there's risk. And we've got a new government who's clear, and they're clearly kind of thinking through this National Commission of Audit that they want to do things differently. So I believe that we're in a position where we have a combination of not just market failure and government failure, but also not-for-profit sector failure. Given the amount of scale of activities in the not-for-profit sector, scale of activities in government, it does seem slightly odd that there's still that 3.1 million people who are financially excluded, a significant number who are living below the poverty line. So given that context, then my view is that we need a completely new mindset in how we actually kind of address these issues. And if we are going to develop a new mindset, then I think we have to recognize the weaknesses with the existing ways we go about things. So my belief is that the efforts in government and the not-for-profit sector have probably reached the outer limits of their potential, and that the relationship between government and the not-for-profit sector it will increasingly become problematic. The decreasing tax revenues will be a problem. The notion that the incoming government may choose to adopt a big society type approach, they won't call it that, but the notion of it significantly increasing the scale of outsourcing to private organisations, those that sit outside of government. Yet we know that there's a limit to the levels of philanthropy in this country, and there's also a high level of volunteering, but it isn't kind of at a level which can take on responsibility for delivering public services. So with that dependency between government and not-for-profit sector in terms of outsourcing, that is going to continue. That National Commission of Audit, you know full well that's what's going to be a major recommendation, that further parts of government will be outsourced to the private sector, and obviously in certain areas that will be business, but a lot of it will be not-for-profits. And we've seen with the Victorian state government, Peter Shergold's report, a significant recommendation in there about kind of outsourcing. So that's a context for what we're doing. But the only problem is most not-for-profit organisations are undercapitalised, under-resourced in other kind of aspects, and ultimately operate on what I call a cash flow model. Short-term funding agreements, money comes in, employ people, money goes out, and the tap of funding can be switched off in the short term. So we have a vast part of our public service delivery system which is actually based on a short-term model trying to address these long-term wicked social problems. So it has to change. So social enterprise is one of the responses. And I think this morning we've heard a lot of examples of trying to stimulate social entrepreneurship and social enterprise and the different models of social enterprise. We've also seen an example of a large corporate looking at one area in terms of a social problem, formulating a really systematic response. So we have an issue of scale here. You can have the bottom up trying to kind of stimulate activity, but you've also got potentially large organisations, corporate organisations getting involved. Now, I just want to run through a couple of frameworks which I think are going to be increasingly important. In the UK, over the last 5 or 6 years, there's been a massive increase in the delivery of public services by cooperatives or mutuals. And this has been driven by a series of government policies, the right to provide. So if you're working within government and you feel that you can actually operate that service better independently through a social enterprise, you can actually go to government and say, we want to actually become independent, create our own social enterprise, a public service mutual. And over recent years, that number of public service mutuals has gone up to 72 or 73, I think it is now, and they're delivering $2 billion worth of public services. These are employee-owned social enterprises. And you think, well, why should the employees take on that responsibility? But as we've heard, a lot of people within corporates and also within government are social entrepreneurs. They can see how they can actually address social problems by utilising their skills and expertise. There's often a really constrained entrepreneurial spirit within both corporate employees, big corporate employees, but also government. So that's one driver. Public service mutuals are actually freeing the entrepreneurial spirit within government. Now, government isn't just saying, right, that's it, you can go off, 10 of you can go off and set up this social enterprise, and that's it. Government obviously is incentivized to ensure that social enterprise is going to be a success. So they'll enter into a long-term contract, often 10 years. They'll actually say, great, you create your employee-owned business, we'll give you a 10-year contract, and you have to deliver the core outcomes that we've set out. And they think, well, is that really saving money? Is that helping government? It's obviously devolving responsibility closer to the front line, to the clients, which is great. We all know that that's a better way of actually doing service delivery, being close to the client. But what happens is those organisations are embedded within communities. So they deliver their core service, but what they end up doing is delivering additional services, building relationships with local organisations, diversifying their income streams so they become sustainable financially. And because they're actually then working across government silos, the services they deliver are much higher quality. They're also able to provide services often, not to the main client group, but say an additional client group, and generate kind of genuine kind of commercial revenues off that. So these things have got huge potential in the UK, and the government has actually, in the UK, has created these policy levers to make it happen. You can sit within government and say, I want to create a social enterprise, and there's a mechanism to actually make that happen. Now, crucially, in addition to that, there is another policy called Right to Challenge, where communities can say, we want to actually deliver those public services ourselves. We want the right to actually take responsibility, take ownership of delivering that public service. So then you have community-owned social enterprises, once again, often using cooperative model, to actually kind of deliver those services. Libraries, sports centres, a whole range of potential kind of policy areas where that can happen. Now, one of the reasons why this works well in the UK is because those social enterprises are community interest companies. And this is a legal form which has an asset lock. So when government enters into that 10-year contract, spins that organisation out from the apparatus of government, they know that that business cannot be sold off to a commercial entity without it being of always value to the community. There is an asset lock, which means the activity has to be for public benefit and for community benefit. I think that's a fantastic way of, forget the big society, but actually giving communities and those who work within the public service the ability to take responsibility and I think actually deliver much better services. Now, I think the potential of doing this here in Australia is not as big as the UK because there's already this massive level of outsourcing to the not-for-profit sector. So one of my challenges is, perhaps it should be some of those large not-for-profit organisations who should be thinking about spinning out organisations, social enterprises, out of their structures. I mean, we've seen some great examples of not-for-profits creating social enterprises, but doing it systematically. What about if a not-for-profit was thinking about withdrawing a service here in Northern Rivers? Can't the employees who are currently delivering that service have the right to actually request to actually continue to deliver that service and potentially diversify the revenue streams by widening their service delivery and perhaps working with other organisations locally? So maybe how that particular idea plays out here in Australia may be different, and maybe it's a not-for-profit sector that actually spins out parts of its organisation. I also think there's a huge potential for a dramatic expansion of public service delivery by cooperatives. And I'll just take kind of one example of one wonderfully successful health co-op, West Belconnen Health Co-op in Canberra, now called the National Health Co-op because they're expanding. So that was set up to address a particular community need. There was no access to bulk build GP services in the area of Canberra. Community got together. It took quite a long time to create the co-op, work on the business model. And just an aside, one of the things which I find really fascinating about the cooperative legal form is you can't get registered as a co-op unless your business plan is approved by the registrar. So this isn't like starting a business and you take a company's limited by guarantee, $50 or $100 kind of fee to your accountant, and that's it. If you want to register as a co-op, you have to go through a process. So in terms of sustainability, establishing an organisation with a really strong business plan to me sounds very attractive. For them in West Belconnen, that forced them to understand how they're actually going to make a consumer cooperative model where the local citizens could actually join the co-op and take ownership of their own GP and health facilities locally. So it started small with one GP and obviously building their books. They're now up to 24 GPs and 24,000 owners of that health co-op. My big interest now is to see whether they adopt a social franchising approach to extend. They've extended organically into their neighbouring areas. But if that kind of access to bulk build services is a problem in low-income communities here in Northern Rivers, then there is a wonderful model which potentially is there to be emulated. And just in terms of some of the problems that I have with this research that I've been doing over the last kind of 9 months on some of this stuff, everywhere you look, you see fantastic examples, but we haven't got the case studies which are easily accessible for people in other parts of the country to say, yes, that's our problem, and look, here's a model, and we can go out and emulate it. So I think if you want to turn some of these bottom-up solutions, they end up just being one-offs, when in theory, there should be this way of actually transferring that knowledge, the templates and so on, so they're available to all communities. So wouldn't it be great if we can actually kind of replicate that model, where that particular problem is such where it needs an alternative to, solution to what's already available. Now, looking at one particular policy area which is going to dominate, in terms of the public policy agenda, the next 3 or 4 years, is the National Disability Insurance Scheme. My own perspective on this is I'm pretty concerned about what's going to happen in terms of how that market is going to change when increasingly consumers have a choice of what they can do. I've got a strong belief that that system will work a lot better if we're able to create community-based consumer cooperatives who can then bulk buy the services. It addresses things like information asymmetry, where you don't know quite what the right services you can have. Collectively, you can get the right expertise to design the services. And obviously, consumer cooperatives can actually design their own services to make sure those services are the best possible. And then for the lots of small, medium-sized disability service providers, you can be like plumbers' supplies, and you can all group together to appear as one organisation when it comes to marketing and contracting and so on. So each of the small organisations working collectively will end up kind of delivering a lot better outcome. So that's one area which I think is a completely different way of approaching public service delivery and addressing these wicked social problems. The next area, and we've already heard a kind of great example from Corinne and NAB in terms of what they're doing in terms of financial exclusion and their microfinance programs. We just completed a case study, 8 case studies of Australian-based businesses who are systematically seeking to co-create commercial and social value. They've realised that they can actually get a commercial return by delivering products and services which have got a social benefit attached to them. And I won't kind of preempt, we're launching this next week at a conference down in Melbourne. But the Professor Michael Porter and then Mark Kramer, when they launched the paper on creating shared value back in 2011, what it did was basically create a new mental map for businesses, where businesses now have a mandate to look at creating social value as well as commercial value. And I think this is part of the, whether it's public service mutuals or creating shared value, this is the notion of trying to do things differently. We don't have to continue doing the things in the past which have failed to deliver. We've also recognised as part of that, and I think we've seen it this morning, for those corporates who are doing this creation of shared value, there has to be leadership. And that leadership can come from the top of the organisation or by these social entrepreneurs who realise that they can utilise the resources of their organisation for social benefit. Another thing which is absolutely crucial, and once again going back to the NAB example, you can only create shared value if you really understand the challenges which citizens and communities face. Working with a not-for-profit organisation like Good Shepherd allows you to get a deep insight into the realities of people on low incomes. So you can't create social value unless you're close to the community. So I think increasingly corporates will be looking to partner with not-for-profit organisations and social enterprises to allow them to create social value. And it'll be a completely different relationship to corporate philanthropy or corporate social responsibility. Corporates will be looking for people in communities to work with who understand their community and their problems, and in partnership can create a service which is financially sustainable that delivers long-term social outcomes. So that's another method. The final method I want to focus in on is the social impact bonds as an example of mechanisms which engage all 3 sectors in this co-creation of commercial and social value. Social impact bonds, created in the UK, was recognising that often not-for-profits are undercapitalised, under-financed, under-resourced, and you're not having kind of the systems that are necessary. A social impact bond allows you to access private capital to run a service over a long period of time. So this goes back to my point. Most not-for-profits are just operating a really short-term revenue model. A social impact bond allows you to operate a longer-term, well-funded service And if you do deliver the outcomes that you promised at the beginning of a social impact bond, the investors get back not just their capital, but also a reward for using their capital. People will say, isn't that kind of, people making money out of social problems? Well, the bottom line is, if you look at the Uniting Care Burnside Newpin social impact bond, $7 million worth of private capital has been raised with a 12-13% upside reward if they're successful, a 25% loss if they fail to hit their targets. The investors will lose part of their capital. But the amount of cost savings to government, long-term cost saving, runs into about $80 million by reducing out-of-home care costs for the thousands of kids who are in out-of-home care. That will only work if corporates work very closely with not-for-profits and social enterprises to make these things happen. Government can't make it happen. Not-for-profit organisations on their own, social enterprises on their own can't make it happen. Corporates on their own can't make it happen. It's all got to be done through collaboration. So those are three examples, I think, of how we can do things differently. One which I won't kind of do anything other than mention, but linked to that collaboration point is the notion of collective impact, where communities come together to try and solve issues. And those things work best if all sectors are represented and where somebody is motivated and mandated to actually deliver some solutions. And I think social enterprise has a huge role to play in that. So just finally, in terms of what I think we need to do is to recognise that these mindsets are changing, and we should be supporting that change and not be dragged into agreeing to do things the old way. Whether it's government contracts, social impact bonds, let's go and experiment and trial the new ways of doing things. And another kind of key thing in terms of making this happen, social enterprises, these new public service mutuals, if they come out, they will require support. There has to be intermediary bodies that help them access the expertise and to go through some of the growth and the change stages and so on. So if you think about this as an ecosystem, we're trying to kind of get all these things to flourish, but they're only going to flourish if we've got bodies which are tasked with helping make it happen. So that's where I think the future is going to be, but it's going to be quite a challenge to get there, I think.
Les, that was fantastic. I was particularly interested about the UK model in the challenge the government would have had with establishing it from a community base, which would be a threat to the bureaucrats, potentially, of diminishing their departments. Have you got a response to that?
Yeah.
Sorry, you got the microphone.
The context for the UK is probably over a life cycle of an economic cycle, there's going to be a 40% reduction in public expenditure. The only way that can be achieved is if things are done differently. And the reason why I think the right to challenge, where communities can say they want to take over responsibility, and although obviously the public servants who are administering budgets and so on might see this as a threat, the reality is the bigger picture game is such that they're open to it. And the key bit of learning in the UK is they've got a unit within the Cabinet Office which promotes all of this work. So right in the heart of government, there's an agency which is basically saying this is a really good thing, we want to see more of it. And what they do is once they've got one bit of government spun out or the community taking ownership of it and delivering themselves, they do then promote it, and they actively encourage other communities to then think about doing the same strategy. So we are talking about really a really pulling back of government. I don't know whether there's an appetite for this here in Australia, and that's why I think it may be more relevant for not-for-profit organisations when they're faced with difficult decisions around closing services in often regional and rural communities because of the lack of budget to deliver the service to a quality. Yet they may be able to kind of work with others to actually make it survive. Where is the same right to challenge? Maybe not-for-profits are almost as bureaucratised and siloed as government. So I'm optimistic.
Gee, Les, that was a really inspiring, and it was all new stuff to me, really exciting. The question that begs for me is, are you a lone voice in Australia, or is your website actually saying, and clearly you would think from Conservatives to Greens, everyone would see that community control of delivery of services is sensible and probably more economic. So are you sort of a part of some think tank? And if not, is your website delivering, writing up these options? And you know, are you having meetings with all the major political parties? Thank you. And presumably even Mr. Palmer would think it was a very good idea.
I don't want to sound as if I take everything from the UK and bring it here. And if feasibility study for social impact bonds, the model there was never going to work here without significant changes, which is what we did. But the way I think I answer your question is, we're pulling all of this information together into a green paper. So the function of a green paper in the UK is to synthesize all the knowledge, set out the potential, set out the challenge, and then invite people to provide feedback on it. Politicians, social enterprises, not-for-profit organisations. Harness all of that feedback and then turn it into a white paper, which is, this is what I think we should be doing. Now, green papers and white papers, you think about government. I think we've got to do this from outside of government. This is what the communities want. So we're preparing the green paper on these public service mutuals, which we'll be submitting to the National Commission of Audit on Tuesday, which is the deadline for feedback on their terms of reference, where it says not-for-profits and businesses. No mention of social enterprises, no mention of co-ops and mutuals. Yet in the UK, as you pointed out, these policies were started by Labour and picked up and then run with by the coalition government. There is cross-party support for the types of things we've been talking about. So there's no reason why there should be any opposition to giving communities the opportunity. And for those people who are delivering services to be doing it, incentivised to be running a sustainable business, delivering social value through employee ownership. Rumour has it that there's interest with Kevin Andrews and one or two other people within government that they will actually receive this proposal and act on it. But if we do a green paper and we get lots of feedback, which we can then use, and then we can actually articulate the level of support, then I think we're more likely to be successful.
Les, could I just ask you to give it just a little bit more on the social bonds? My understanding is that social bonds were used, came into play when, especially when Good Start took over ABC Learning. I may be incorrect here, but the concept around social bonds, that if I'm a non-profit and needing money, and you have money that you can potentially put the money into my non-profit, you get a 12% return, and if it fails, there's a 25% loss. Is it backed by the government, and are these something that are actually going to be growing within Australia? Because I think it's sort of relevant to a lot of different organisations.
Yeah. Well, social impact bonds is what I was referring to. There is government guarantee, so that's the 75%. So the UK model, which was looked at to be replicated here, and Cheryl Kerner was part of the team with Peter Shergold and myself and one or two others, we rejected that notion. That was all at risk. The Peterborough Social Impact Bond, the people who invested in it, if the one service which delivered the recidivism reduction program failed to hit their targets, all those investors would lose all their money.
Right.
When we put that to not-for-profit organisations, government agencies and investors, they said, forget that. Everybody's got to have skin in the game. So we structured it differently, so government would actually provide a guarantee. So investors would only lose a certain amount, say 25%, and the upside would be almost kind of commercial rates and bond type structure. Probably not the right kind of risk return ratio, but certainly something which is incentivised with the Benevolent Society with their social impact bond, and also the Uniting Care Nuclear one. Both have been oversubscribed, so I understand. So there's a real appetite for it. The only trouble is I have with the New South Wales social benefit bonds, as they're called, I think they've built a Rolls Royce. And it's the same with Good Start. Good Start is a fantastic social enterprise took over a failed for-profit business and turned it into a social enterprise. But these are huge and really difficult to replicate. So the 3 social benefit bonds which are in formulation, they've taken 2.5 years to actually come to fruition. What we're seeing in the UK now is they're actually generating these things very, very quickly. There's about 25 of them now. And they've really lowered the specification, just making them simple and attractive to investors, delivering social return and with a commercial return, often not with such long-term, 7-year kind of durations and so on. So we have to move very quickly to, okay, we've shown it's possible with these big ones, these Rolls Royces. We now need to be rolling out some smaller scale, simpler structures, which are still useful as a tool within communities. But we will see more of them. I don't see anything different. Queensland are introducing a payment by outcomes policy. They're looking to, for funding, like in the UK when David Cameron said he wants to put rocket boosters under payment by outcomes and social impact bonds. He wants them to be the norm for funding relationships, with those who provide the services.
Les, thank you very much for your presentation this afternoon.